Hey guys, this is Father Charlie Kahlberg, All Saints Anglican Church here in Greenville, South Carolina, and you've reached the home of our All Saints video devotion. We're starting a two-part series today on the Ascension, and very oftentimes the Ascension gets overlooked. We rush straight from Easter and the resurrection right to Pentecost and the coming of the Holy Spirit and all but forget about the Ascension, but we ought not to. The Ascension is a big deal. Remember, Jesus doesn't say, I must first be raised from the dead and then the Holy Spirit will come. Instead, what Jesus says is, I must first ascend to the Father and then the Holy Spirit will come. In fact, Jesus goes on to say that if I don't ascend to the Father, then the Holy Spirit won't come. And that doesn't just mean that we won't have extraordinary spiritual gifts or powerful worship experiences. What Jesus is saying is that unless I ascend, unless the ascension occurs, then the one whose job it is to apply the salvation I accomplished for you to you, he won't come. In other words, without the ascension, the Holy Spirit doesn't come to make the salvation that Christ accomplished for you yours. And that's a big deal. And so we want to know why. What's going on in the ascension that makes it this vital connection for the coming of the Holy Spirit? And I hope that by the end of our two-part series, you'll have a clearer understanding of that and also have a deeper appreciation of this extraordinary salvation that Christ has accomplished for us. Anyway, if it ministers to you, like it, share it, comment on it. We hope it'll be a blessing to you as well as to many others. And anyway, part one of our Ascension video right now. So why is the Ascension such a big deal? Well, remember, Jesus did not say, before I pour out my Holy Spirit on you, I must first be raised from the grave. Instead, Jesus said, I must first ascend to the Father, and then I will pour out my Holy Spirit on you. Now, why is that? What is the vital connection between the Ascension and Pentecost? Well, the good news is that we can answer this question in just two words: presentation and application. However, to understand the significance of these two words, we need to return to the Old Testament and the picture that God gave His people of the salvation that Christ was coming to accomplish. First, there is presentation. Notice then in Leviticus 16:15, in the very heart of the Old Testament sacrificial system, God commands Moses, saying, Aaron shall slaughter the goat of the sin offering, which is for the people. In other words, a sacrifice is made for the sins of God's people. Next, God says, and then Aaron shall bring its blood inside the veil. Notice then, the sacrifice made is deemed acceptable. Now, how do we know this? We know that the sacrifice is acceptable to God because Aaron the high priest is alive. If Aaron had entered the Holy of Holies with an unacceptable sacrifice, he would be dead. Finally, God commands Aaron to sprinkle the blood on the mercy seat and in front of the mercy seat. In other words, the acceptable sacrifice is presented to God and remains before God. Notice then, when we turn to the New Testament, we find that Christ perfectly fulfills this very pattern of redemption. A sacrifice is made. It is deemed acceptable. Now, how do we know it's acceptable? We know because Christ, our high priest, is alive. If Christ's sacrifice had failed to pay for even one of the sins that He bore, He would still be in the grave. Finally, Christ presents His perfect, acceptable sacrifice to God. But where do we see this crucial aspect of salvation fulfilled by Christ? The answer is the Ascension. In fact, the whole point of Hebrews chapter 9, verses 11 through 12, is to show that Christ's ascension perfectly fulfills the promise and pattern of salvation that God had given to His people back in our passage from Leviticus. Hebrews says that after the cross and the resurrection, Christ, our high priest, entered into the greater and more perfect tabernacle. In other words, while Aaron carried the sacrifice he had made into the Old Testament tabernacle on earth, Christ entered into heaven itself. There's the ascension. Not only that, Hebrews goes on to tell us that Christ entered the courts of heaven not with the blood of goats and calves like Aaron did, but with his own blood he entered the holy place once for all. Why did Christ enter the courts of heaven with his own blood? Hebrews 9:24 goes on to tell us that Christ entered into heaven itself now to appear in the presence of God for us. In other words, Christ ascends to heaven in order to present himself before the very throne of God as our full and complete sacrifice. Now, next week we will need to look at our second word to see why this presentation is such a big deal and why the coming of the Holy Spirit is directly tied to it. But for now, just remember, Christ, your all-sufficient sacrifice, is ever before the throne of God on your behalf. And that's why the Ascension is such a big deal. Now you know. Thank you for watching.